prefer the term exile to refer to their status. And this is an indication of how close some still are to the exile generation of the 1960s, whose politics weighed heavily into some of these writers. Cuba and Cuban politics still play a major role in their identity and the literature. To the writers that follow, those who fall squarely in the second generation because they were born in the U.S., maintain or change this profile. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge that Cuban-American literature is thriving as we speak. A growing number of young writers are very active in the field, writing stories, novels, and poetry, as well as journalistic pieces that can be found on the internet. Disclaimer, you have to understand that young in this field means people in their 30s and their 40s, because it is rarely the case that someone in the 20s is recognized as a poet or as a fiction writer. As far as I've been able to ascertain, the youngest among the writers of the second generation, Janine Pt.2, was born in 1981. And the oldest probably in the mid to late 60s. And I say probably because, despite my efforts, I haven't been able to establish a couple of dates of birth. They're not forthcoming with that information. Pt.2, as well as Ana Menendez, Vanessa Garcia, Cecilia Rodríguez Milanel, Chantel Acevedo, Richard Blanco, Carmen Peláez, and Cristina Díaz-González, have been publishing and or presenting their work as performers and playwrights since the turn of the millennium. The earliest works were published in 1998. And have recently come out with new and exciting work, most of which has received good reviews. Because there are emerging writers, it takes some audacity to delineate common features. However, based on what has appeared in thus far, I dare to identify 3 areas where they deviate somewhat from the previous cohort, the 1.5 generation. The 3 elements that I think differentiate this generation are, number 1, their ties to Miami and the centrality of the city in some of the works. 2, the critical stance vis-a-vis the Cuban-American community, including enclave politics and its unwillingness to engage Cuba. And 3, the primacy of female writers. With respect to the first, all of these writers have ties to Miami, interestingly, either because they grew up here or have spent time in the city. Cruzet, Acevedo, and Peláez were born in Miami, the first 2 in Hialeah. Menendez and Blanco were born in Los Angeles and Madrid, respectively, but moved to Tampa and Miami, and they are both graduates of FIU. And Rodríguez Milanés was born in New Jersey, but came to Miami with her family when she was 14, and received degrees from the University of Miami and Barry University. Cristina Díaz-González, who has published 1 novel, was raised in a small southern town and moved to Miami as well. The work is informed by the place they grew up in, of course, and where they live, some of them live. Pt.2 admits, and I quote, my writing has been shaped by South Florida, its people and its landscape, and by the stories of Cuba repeated to me almost daily by my parents and abuelos. Gustavo Pérez Fumat once said that the major influence of Cuban Americans in Miami was found in popular culture, thinking about the likes of Gloria Estefan and Willie Chirino. And that may have been the case 20 years ago, but today there's a group of writers who are adding to the visibility of the city in areas other than popular culture in very constructive, positive ways. It is to be expected then that the Cuban-American community in South Florida would often serve as the backdrop to the story they tell, more so than in the literature of the 1.5 generation. This is true in How to Live Like Hialeah from 2009, the short story collection, and the novel Make Your Home Among Strangers, 2015, both by Pt.2. In The Prince of the Cocuyos, 2014, and some of the poems in City of the 100 Fires, 98, by Richard Blanco. In Cuba, I Was a German Shepherd, 2001, and Loving Che, 2003, by Ana Menendez. In White Light, 2015, by Vanessa Garcia. And in Roman Hope, 1998, by Carmen Peláez. In these works, Miami is the city where the characters' roots are firmly planted, but it is also a conflicted place, one from which some of the characters want to flee. This may be due to the way the Cuban-American community, as portrayed in the literature, clings to the old ways from a cultural standpoint, resisting change, or it may be due to its opposition to engage Cuba, which is perceived by the writers as the original homeland, ironically so, and it is thus impossible to dismiss. The city may be a magnet for Cuban Americans, yet there is some ambivalence about it in most of these works. This brings me to another facet of the second difference I have noticed. Cuba and the Cuban community in Miami are no doubt present in these works, although not always. I mean, they don't necessarily have to be lo cubano at the center of the works. But I would add that exile politics play a lesser role, I think it should be expected. Rarely are there young characters that feel passionate about fighting the Castro regime. On the contrary, they tend to be critical of their predecessors for putting politics ahead of family relations, a relationship with the homeland, or tolerance toward more recent arrivals. Exile politics, though not totally absent, are approached through a critical lens. Examples of this attitude are found in Capo Cruz's Make Your Home Among Strangers, and Rodriguez Milanés' Marielitos, Balseros, and other exiles from 2009. For the most part, these writers are beyond Cold War rhetoric. Rodriguez Milanés delves instead on intra-ethnic conflicts, showing how Marielitos and Balseros alike have been mistreated by the earlier waves of Cuban exile. A related issue is the working class background of some of the characters, like those in Cecilia Rodriguez Milanés' stories, characters whose day-to-day concerns steer them away from politics as an obsession. These characters appear also in settings like Hialeah and Union City, working class cities. The third feature I wanted to highlight is obvious by now. The majority of the writers of this generation are women, and they write mostly about topics revolving around the female experience, like personal relationships, the need for self-definition and self-reliance, and the struggles to get ahead in a patriarchal society. Cuban-American literature used to be a field largely dominated by males, but that is no longer valid, and this is a welcome change. These authors have joined the ranks of Latina writers in the U.S. and collaborate with others as such. For example, the inspiring volume, White Latinas, Writers on Higher Education, includes essays by Capo Cruz, Rodriguez Milanés, and Acevedo, along with others of Cuban descent. Alongside other Latinas, they write eloquently about the compromises they've had to make to balance family, ethnicity, and the determination to get ahead in their native land, the U.S. What we are missing, though, is an anthology of writings of the second generation that could provide a sense of collective identity. Similar to what volumes like Cuban-American writers, Los Atrevidos by Carolina Hospital, and other volumes did at the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, for the 1.5 generation. And there is evidence, though, that the writers are connected to one another. They read one another. They write reviews of others' works. But proof of a cohesive identity, a collective identity, has yet to emerge. These are three areas, though. The significance of Miami, the critical attitude toward its own ethnic community, and the roster of female writers where differences arise. But there are also continuities between the two generations, and I would like to comment on one. For the 1.5 generation, Cuba was a primary point of reference. In their memoirs and fiction writing, these writers always go back to Cuba in some fashion, even if returning does not guarantee smooth relationship with the island. The going back is accomplished through a variety of means. It may be a physical return that is turned into a chronicle or featured in a memoir, the recreation of the childhood in Cuba, an evocation of the first years, as disruptive as they were, of the Cuban Revolution, a fictional return to Cuba through characters in the novel. For the second generation, Miami is sometimes the closest they get to Cuba, but not always. As Vanessa Garcia writes, at some point they realized, and I quote, that Miami was not Havana, that there was an original out there of our carbon copy, end of quote. Some of these writers will return, physically speaking, to their ancestral homeland through their work and through their travel. Several of Paco Cruz's and Cecilia Rodriguez Milanés stories are set in Cuba, and a number of Richard Blanco's poems draw from his first trip to the island. This applies also to many of to some of Cantera Acevedo's novels, such as The Distant Marbles and Love and Ghost Letters. A Falling Star, on the other hand, takes place between Miami and Cuba in a contrapuntal fashion that recalls earlier work by the one and a half generation. So does Ana Menendez's Loviche, whose protagonist goes to Cuba in search of her father, who might be Che Guevara. Richard Blanco's poetry collection, City of 100 Fires, is inspired by Little Havana as much as Varadero, Cienfuegos, and Havana. Cristina Garcia Gonzalez's first and only novel thus far, The Red Umbrella, is about siblings who are sent to the U.S. through the Peter Pan operation. And the action takes place in both countries. Vanessa Garcia's play, The Cuban Spring, 2014, and Carmen Pelay's performance piece, Rum and Coke, featured young characters willing to risk it all to make it to Cuba, the land of their ancestors, despite their elders' opposition. The U.S. may be their birthplace, but they all want to, and I love this phrase, to go back to Cuba for the first time. As a Cuban-American film critic, Monica Castillo of the second generation has put it, to go back to Cuba for the first time. Cuba is sometimes seen through rose-tinted glasses, no doubt about it, like in Richard Blanco's poem Havanazis, which describes how God created Cuba in 7 days and endowed it with papaya, coco, halao, and coal, and lata. In other words, it appears as a hellish place, as in Cristina Díaz González's The Red Umbrella. Mostly, though, as I mentioned, politics are far from being a major concern. The interest in that other homeland, of course, does not mean that this cohort writes exclusively about Cuban matters. Ana Menendez Labor is set in the Middle East, Vanessa Garcia to Wildlife, while taking place in Miami among Cuban Americans and other Latinos, does not make a fuss about Cuban identity, ethnic identity. And Alex Segura, a new writer who's supposed to come out with 2 noir novels later this spring, given reports on the web, the novels seem to be shorn of any concerns about identity. Still, it is undeniable that Cuba exerts an influence in post-memory of second-generation writers. Some of them, some of whom consider themselves Cuban, as Peláez states, and I quote, "I'm Cuban because I was born in Miami, and Miami is what Cuba would have been for better or for worse. I could have moved to Alaska, to the middle of nowhere, but I would still have to, I would still have been more Cuban than sure." Others identify as American-born Cubans, like Vanessa Garcia. So the topic of identity, as well as displacement and loss, is still very relevant among writers of this cohort. The re-establishment of relations with Cuba is likely to spur the interest in visiting the island, making it possible for some of these writers to experience Cuba firsthand. There is no question that they share an interest in doing so. Vanessa Garcia writes about breaking what she calls a familial embargo, stating, "The irony was that the same people who find my desire to go, were also the ones who impeded it." After much resistance, Garcia convinced her mother to go to Cuba with her, and she is writing a book called Cuban Roots, R-O-U-T-S, about the trip, arguing that her generation's responsibility is to be a bridge of understanding. She argues that because they are American-born Cubans, they have a unique point of view that should be taken into consideration at this time of transition in Cuba. All the Cuban-Americans of the second generation, however, still feel deeply ambivalent about visiting Cuba, recalling the complexity, loss, and challenge that previous generations have had to face. I would say then that the attitude toward Cuba might be different for the 1.5 and the second generation, but that Cuba is a chief concern for both. If the writers of the second generation make it to Cuba, however, they are likely to echo Pilar, the young protagonist of Cristina Garcia's Dreaming in Cuban, who confesses at the end of the novel, "I'm afraid to lose all this, to lose Abuela Celia again. But sooner or later, I'll have to return to New York. I know now it's where I belong, not instead of here, but more." Except that these writers will be returning not to New York, but mostly to Miami.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you so much. And thank you to Michael and Jorge and everybody involved with putting this done together, as well as panelists for being here, and for all of you that are coming on a beautiful Friday afternoon. To prepare for this panel today, I went over some of the, went back through some of the books from Cuban-Americans, and I'm happy to have on my shelves books by people that Pilar has already mentioned, H. Ovejas, Chantal Acevedo, Cristina Garcia, Janine Capo-Cruzet, Pablo Medina, Roberto Fernandez. And it struck me that in most of our published works, and here I include my own, most of them, Spanish is there to give, the Spanish that's used in the books is there to give a sense of the ghostly language that's lurking behind these English constructions. And so from 1.5 generation writers like Pablo to young writers like Janine, almost all of these books have some reference to el loco or la loca. There's some reason they're only saying it in Spanish. And you find viejos sinvergüenza, which is a great word too. You find people offering, making ofrendas or talking about la zafra, eating picadillo, saying carajo. But then we get to the curious case of Roberto Fernandez with his shrimp at the little garlic and saw at the oven and churn at the iron. And this is interesting because then with Roberto Fernandez we're getting into language as code, as insider, kind of bond even. And I find this interesting because when I'm with other Cuban Americans, this is the way that I bond. Using these words that are bonding words. They don't mean anything to anybody else. So what follows is an experiment, kind of a thought experiment in this vein. It is, in a way, an essay for insiders. It's written in Miami English. And I think those of us who grew up here, even though I moved to Miami in 1984, but we were always coming back and forth. So those of us who grew up here in the 70s and 80s will find a kind of cozy belonging, I think. If exile, as Joseph Brodsky famously observed, is a linguistic event, then those of us who are the sons and daughters of exiles are living in the linguistic aftermath. Recently, in December, I spoke to a group of graduate students, FIU graduate students actually, and most of them were like me, Americans born of Cubans. And the conversation turned to language, the beautiful, sometimes mad ajiaco we've made of it. And they were too young. It was interesting to find out they were too young to appreciate the innovations of my generation. And so I was sad to learn that no one said anymore when they didn't want to be stood up, "Don't embarcate me." Don't embarcate. None of these young, I say young, I also consider myself young, but literally, literature speaking young. But then none of them said that. I said, "Don't embarkate me," and they were just blank faces. But one young woman told a story in this kind of inimitable deadpan style that had all of us laughing for a very long time. She didn't speak Spanish well, although she was Cuban-American, but she had absorbed Miami's Creole vocabulary. She recounted, in her first year of undergraduate school somewhere up north, for the first time exclusively among Americans. And she'd been lounging in her dorm, kind of wasting time, when she received an invitation to attend a party, which she happily accepted. And when she arrived, the others asked what she'd been doing, and she said, "Oh, nothing, just sitting in my room eating shit." The gathering, as she recounted, went suddenly deathly quiet. And people didn't know where to look. And finally, somebody whispered, "You are doing what?" That's when this young woman realized that when trying to convey a sense of stupid inattention, no one in America says eating shit, only in Miami. I talk and write about language now, what it can and cannot do, the pleasures of knowing more than one, the way it speaks to our deepest self. But I had somehow missed that crucial moment when comiendo mierda had leaped the linguistic divide. The whole thing took me back, though, 30 years, to a time when our language, which went beyond the words we spoke, was being forged in the collision of these two worlds we had inherited. And I'll pause to say that this is an academic panel, and I don't really belong here. And when I tried to deflect the invitation to join, I was assured that my contributions as an ordinary writer would be enough. So with apologies to all, not least of which is my distinguished panel, all I have to offer is a story. I'm going to take you back to 1983, because it's only in retrospect that you see your childhood in context and realize how singular it really was. I was 13, part of the generation that was born in the United States immediately following Castro's revolution, part and not part of America, which was this strange land of loose women and feral children and Ronald Reagan. It was a country that we admired and reviled, loved and were afraid of. Years before, our parents had packed their middle-class, mid-century values in Havana. And though these threads emerged wrinkled and irreparably damaged in exile, our parents insisted on dressing us in them. 1983. These were Viva por Ru scented days of lechones and encuentros en los parques, of pullovers and baseball and te llamo pa' atrás and sorry con el Cuba, of going to El Tencent and drinking Siete and figuring out if you had to light candles to this new sangui, of boys who sweated Dracar Noir and wore gold chains and drove their Camaros too fast, but not so fast as to spoil their rims, of going to parties that always ended with couples tightly swaying to Europa, parties we pause now to note that a respectful girl could only attend in the company of a chaperone. Chaperones, the original mothers of invention. Without them, would we have perfected the skills of slipping out of bedroom windows in the middle of the night? Would we have come up with the exquisite pastime of making out next to the Volvo in the garage after everyone else had gone to sleep? Without chaperonas, how would we have learned that lust is 1 part hormones and 3 parts illicit thrill? Without these stern tias, would we have even noticed the roomful of bliss that lay just beyond their hard glare? My eldest cousin, we'll call her Sarah to protect the innocence of the past, was 16. My other cousin, who had just arrived from Cuba, was 50. We'll call her Marisol. She was profane, exotic, fearless, everything that I at 13 was not. Sarah, the older one, had one of those Dracar boyfriends with a Camaro, and every Friday and Saturday night they went on dates. For some mysterious reason unknown to us children at the time, the adults in the family had abandoned the idea of an adult chaperone. And instead, beginning that summer, Marisol and I were to serve as Sarah's chaperones. So there we were, alone after dark, a homely 13-year-old, which was me in plaid and denim, a vivacious, non-English speaking 15-year-old just arrived from Cuba, and we were in charge of these 2 horny 16-year-olds. We ended up at Bird Road Park. I looked it up and it's changed names now, it's something else, where Sarah promptly told us to get lost and handed her keys over to Marisol. and vanished with her boyfriend into the moody, tropical hardwood of Birdwood Park. Back then, the streets around the park were nearly deserted at night and very dark. And Marisol, who had zero training, she just arrived from Cuba. She had zero training as a driver, much less a license, took me on the wildest, most heart-stopping ride of my life, just screeching and swerving around the corners, swerving into the oncoming lanes, and I screamed and laughed and cried like the terrified hysteric that I was. The agreement was that we would give Sarah an hour and then return tooting the horn twice. And Marisol was determined to keep up our end of the deal. So there we were, a bunch of teenagers on the loose in suburbia eating shit. And so much could have gone wrong. A cop could have stopped us, could have driven us home, he could have arrested us, and then the world would have ended. But not in the way that you think, because it would have ended in Spanish. Y el mundo se acabó can also refer to just an especially hard rainfall. So it would have stormed for days at home, but it wouldn't have been an actual English language style apocalypse. If this were fiction, something would have happened to us on Marisol's wild ride. Something bad and irreparable that we would continue to look back on all these years later. And maybe someday I'll write that story also. But on this day, nothing at all happened. We drove around, we came back to the park, we picked up the lovers, we didn't crash, and we got back to home before curfew. It was the 80s, and the cops had better things to do. Marisol got us back, we gave our signal, and we all returned home. It was the last summer of the kind of carefree childhood that, though it took place in Miami, in memory, like so many of these memories, I always associate with Cuba. It's that flawed paradise where all good things eventually come to an end. We didn't know it then, of course, but Sarah's mother, who was 41 at the time, would die within the year. And it's only now, when I sat down to write this, that I realized that it was my aunt's illness that was the reason the family had abandoned the idea of chaperones, had abandoned the idea of chaperonas to something more sorrowful and powerful than tradition. And in time, not only the word itself, but the very concept of a chaperona would also be abandoned, and we would be left to our American selves. Walking into the big house in La Sabuesera that evening, we were children for the last time. It would take us a few more years to formulate the phrase, but we already had the sense that we were where we were supposed to be. Our parents' waiting had become home. And someday, long in the future, one of us would write up the whole thing in English.